welcome everyone. Again, this is Mike Stitt. Maybe some of you know me. I'm a long-time DRIer. What we're going to do today is look at the Sightline QCS module. I'll be demonstrating using version 9.0030 of the software, so a fairly applicable or recent release, although 9.01 is coming out here very soon. So this is 9.030. Some of you know the product has been, or many of you probably know the product has been rebranded to the name Cloud Suite or Cloud Suite Industrial. I'll probably refer to it throughout this demonstration as Sightline. So again, we're going to go through the QCS module, and you're seeing a little agenda of what we're going to cover here. This is probably less than an hour. We're going to hit you with some of the high-level functional capabilities, and then we encourage questions. So we'll start with concepts. And as you look at items 2, 3, and 2 through 5, actually, you can think of those as the different modules within the quality system, the QCS system. All right, so I'm now going to jump into the software. And now, again, I'm on 9.030, 9.00.30. And I don't know if some of you folks use these or not, but round about Sightline 8 and moving forward, they started developing these home forms. There is a home form for the QCS module. It's an okay form. It doesn't have as much content as some of the other home forms, but it is a good point. It is a good source to sort of understand the capabilities of QCS and also to navigate from. So what we'll start with, I'm on this QCS home form, but I'm going to quickly move over to the an overview screen that we've developed. And we can make this available to folks if you want it. This is a screen we use for demonstrations, demonstration purposes. And it's a form that has, it's like an accordion kind of form that has different sections over here. So in the first section here, let's focus on this column of buttons right here. And again, that points out the 4 different components of the QCS offering. Now, many of you probably know QCS is obviously it's an optional module, and traditionally those 4 have all been sold separately. So you could buy the PO and purchasing modules separately and uniquely, and you didn't necessarily have to buy the other modules. I believe Infor is thinking about bundling them all together. You can ask Wendy about that afterwards, but there has been some discussion about that. Now, the first 2 are pretty intuitive here. Pio Receiving, that's related to anything that's sort of purchasing or procurement quality related. So as you'll see as we go through the demonstration, when you have an item master record, you can set up what are essentially inspection and test requirements for that item upon PO receipt. And typically, although it doesn't have to play out this, but oftentimes for many companies, when they do a PO receipt, it will invoke certain quality processes, essentially an inspection process. The same basically holds true for the work in process module, but in that case what you're doing is you're identifying or defining inspection or test processes on various steps of the routing. So imagine you had a routing that had 5 steps. With the QCS module, you can say at step 30, you can invoke an inspection or test process at that. And that step can actually be just the typical routing step that exists on the item's routing, or some companies set up specific operations that are sort of dedicated to QCS operations. But the main point there, as you'll see as we go through this, in the work in process module, you're essentially indicating at the routing step level what types of inspections are in play. This one, it says customer/final inspection. It's kind of interesting. It's designed for situations like the following. You have a customer that prior to shipping the material, maybe you have some kind of unique additional inspection requirement or additional sort of gathering of paperwork. So what the QC customer module can do is it can say, hey, before you can ship this, and it literally neuters or nullifies the shipping process until the customer inspection process has been satisfied. And so again, it can ensure that you go through those special inspections for that particular customer. The other thing that that module does, the customer module, is it specifically has tools and capabilities related to the processing of a CFC, a certificate of conformance. So that's what the customer module is all about. And I have a tendency to think of these top three as material-based modules. They're about material or the product that you're buying and making and shipping. The final module is more, you can think of that more as like process quality, where you can dictate what your quality process flows are, and you can actually sort of record things like non-conformances when your business processes are out of line with the stated quality process. This is a fairly underutilized module, I think, in our customer base, but it's actually kind of a clever piece of software. We'll touch on that a little bit, but we'll focus mostly on these top two. All right. Now, if we go to this second tab, and we're on the tab that says QC item setup, and look in this quadrant here where it says SL item going to QC vendor master. You'll see here in a few minutes that we probably all know about the sightline item form, item screen, and the sightline vendor screen. Well, there's a couple of new screens that you get, new forms you get with a quality control module called QC items and QC vendors. And they help sort of define some of the quality characteristics of a particular vendor or of a particular item in particular. So, and those sort of go together to create this sort of master QC item record. And you can see this last box down here, this button that says count frequency. One of the things that's in play there is that you're able to do things like say, hey, when this particular part is received on a PO, we're going to inspect every single receipt, or you can do things like we're going to inspect only every third receipt or every fourth receipt. So that's what the count frequency has to do with. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, as sort of the upper right-hand portion, keep in mind that the QCS module also includes sort of a gauge capability, where you can establish the gauges that are needed for inspection and test processes, and it also has capabilities to sort of manage and control the calibration of gauges. So that's kind of a clever little subsection. If you look down in the sort of the lower right-hand corner now, what this is saying is that when you set up an inspection or test, you can dictate what type of methods. Is this a measurement that requires a specific, quantitative value, or is it more a cosmetic kind of thing that's maybe a visual inspection? And you can also indicate for the various inspection or test components what's the overall severity level, what's important or maybe a little less important. Now, let's move over to this accordion folder, and I like this. I think I would tweak it a little bit, but here, see if you can follow flow here. In a purchasing scenario, and keep in mind a work in process or a production or job order scenario, there's a great deal of similarity in the flow. But what this is saying is, upon PO receipt, the system's going to assess whether an inspection is required. If the answer is no to that, it does kind of typical sightline behavior and moves the material to inventory. But if the answer is yes, then you can kick in this idea of creating what the system calls that has to be, typically you have to gather test results and then eventually disposition those test results. Okay? If the material is inspected and it's good, it's dispositioned to regular use in production. But if there's a problem, that's what this area has to do with, is the system has a nice model for non-conformance management. Okay, so after material has been received, if it's somehow defective or suspicious or somehow non-compliant, it can be moved into what's called MRR status. That stands for Material Review Request. To some degree, it's sort of like, many of you are probably familiar with the term MRB, Material Review Board. So for some of our customers, once you've created an MRR, it's like you've put the material on MRB status. And the system includes some nice features to sort of capture all the typical MRB activities that are related to trying to figure out whether you can use the material or not. Now, with purchased material, once you have a non-conformance or what's called an MRR, you may end up doing things like a disposition of that where you decide that even though the material was somewhat suspicious, you'll use as is. So it's dispositioned into regular use. Or it might be scrapped. Or it may be sent back to the vendor. And when it's sent back to the vendor, the purchasing module of the QCS system has a what's called VRMA capability, Vendor Return Material Authorization. For some of you folks that have used Sightline's regular RMA that's designed to plan and control customers sending material back to your company, it's somewhat similar to that on the vendor side, where when you have defective material, you can use the VRMA process to send the material back to the supplier. And it has some touch points with other areas of the system like accounts payable, because if the vendor has sent you defective material, you'll probably want to kick in the process of somehow taking a credit for that. So it does talk to the AP side of the system. It's a little sketchy, but it does work. And so that's those last few minutes was basically saying the system has a kind of a nice model for non-conformance management, and it's called an MRR, Material Review Request. All right. Lastly, and you don't see it on this particular diagram, but if you have, let's say, a habitual problem with a supplier, a vendor, and you've had many receipts, and the material is often going on the MRB status, maybe for the same part, the same item, then what the QCS module also includes is a corrective action capability, a CAR, corrective action request, that it's kind of a formal way of saying, maybe to a supplier, hey, we've had this problem on an ongoing basis. We're sort of asking you to take specific corrective action actions in order to rectify the problem. So again, there's a corrective action module or capability. So what I just said there, I covered a lot on this. This is a nice diagram. It's a little confusing sometimes, but you'll see that here. We'll demonstrate some of those pieces. The production module is actually, if I look at the flow here, it's almost identical. But again, the key with the production module is at different steps in the build process, you can invoke inspections or tests. And when the material is deemed okay, then the inspection is flagged as passed or okay, and then the material can be moved to the next step in the process, or if that's the last step in the process, it can be moved into inventory. Now, the QC in-process module does include some connection points with, many of you know, sort of job transaction processing, where you're capturing labor time and moving material from one operation to the next, or moving it from one operation on a job and finishing it off into inventory. The QC in-process module can kind of incorporate the ability to capture an inspector's time and then also sort of move the material through the production process. So that's what we'll focus on here in the demonstration. We'll start off with the purchasing or procurement side. So I'm going to go back to the QC Home form here, and there's some buttons on here. If I click QC items, I already had this loaded, so if I go to this QC items screen, what we're looking at here, I'll filter this form. We're looking at AL-10,000. For some of you who remember the demonstration database, this is one of the items that's in the demonstration database. And when I filter on that, I've created this record. This is a form that's specifically part of the QCS module that you begin to use when you begin to use the QC module. And if you look at some of the aspects of this, there's the item number. And by the way this form works is, if I was inserting a record here, because that's really what you have to do. You have your item master table that exists there, and it's kind of the traditional item file in Sightline. And then if you determine an item needs inspection or tests, you come over to this form and you hit the new button to insert a new record. And when you do that, the system will detect that the item already exists. It'll drop in a description. If it's a purchased item, it'll default this little ref type. Let's take a look at that. It'll default that ref type to P for supplier or for purchasing, because it knows if it's a purchased item, you must be wanting to do sort of purchasing-related quality processes. So again, if you look at my item, it's AL-10,000, and it has a ref type of P. Now, for a lot of you grizzled sightline folks, you'll see there's 2 records of AL-10,000 in my collection here. The first one is actually tied to a specific vendor. So, and this is a nice feature actually. So what we're saying in this case is there's something unique about when you buy AL-10,000 from Chromax Metals, that maybe your inspection frequency is different, or when I click on the Test tab, this is where I can start indicating the types of tests or inspections I'm going to go through upon receipt. So when you look in this case, when I'm buying from Chromax Metals, for whatever reason, upon receipt, you want to capture inspection results related to the length of the material, the width of the material, and the height of the material. However, if I was just buying from sort of vendor agnostic, just buying from any vendor, I have a separate record here in Sightline. Again, a lot of you know this is sort of typical Sightline logic. And because there's no vendor listed here, that means any vendor other than Chromax Metals, vendor 6, the inspection process will only trigger a width and height measurement. Okay. Now, if I come back to this first tab, again, I can indicate things like, well, when I'm buying from Chromax Metals, I'm going to inspect every receipt. Okay. Or maybe if I do with Chromax Metals, if I change that to 3, that says I'm only inspecting every 3rd receipt. Okay, I'm going to leave that set at 1. But that's an inspection frequency. And if you look at the drop down here, you got various options. Like if you look at days, that means how many days between receipts, and if you set that at 180 days. Within the 180 days, it's not going to invoke another inspection process until that time has transpired. So you have various options here on the inspection frequency, and that, by the way, is only relevant inspection frequency to the purchasing module. Okay. If you look up in this area, you can do things like indicate first article inspection requirements. We'll touch on that a little bit later, and some of these other things are just these are indicators like, hey, when the material is received, make sure that the supplier has provided a certificate of conformance or certificate of compliance, okay, or a safety data sheet, or you can indicate what kind of regulations are in play. This is a little alert that actually pops up on the receipt, on the PO receipt process. So we're gonna go ahead and jump in and do a receipt here in a minute, but a couple other quick things before we do that. Two in particular. Test family. This is kind of a clever idea. What it basically says is, if you have many different types of materials that all might share the same kind of inspection requirements, you can create a test family inspection requirement, maybe all aluminum that's received, and you might have 58 different aluminum items, and you give all 58 of those aluminum item records that would exist in this QC item table, you tie them to the same test family. So what that allows you to do is not have to create a specific set of tests for each specific QC item record. And make sure I didn't confuse you there. For those 58 items in my example, if you want to invoke inspection and test processes, you do have to get a record set up on the QC items form. For many of you know, you could do things like pasting those records in through paste rows of pen. But ultimately, you're going to need to get a QC item record set up. It's just really for the assignment of tests that you can use a test family. Now, this last thing we'll mention on this screen is the serial track checkbox. That is separate and unique from Sightline serial tracking, okay? Although you look at the header portion of the screen, these are simply indicators of whether this item is lot tracked and in serial tracked from a Sightline perspective. This serial tracked checkbox is not the same as Sightline serial tracked. And really, from a practical standpoint in the QCS module, when you click that on, what that means is as you gather and record tests against the material that you're inspecting, you're going to record test results on an individual item basis. So if you were receiving 20 different circuit boards and you wanted to record inspection processes or inspection results against all 20 different units, you would turn this on, and that sort of enables the idea that I'm going to collect tests on an item by or part by part basis. If I don't have that on, I'm doing more things like, hey, I received 100 parts and I'm going to sample test 20 of them, or some sort of AQL setting. I'm sample testing 15 or 15%. So that's what this serial trap typically plays out to work as. Okay, now what we're going to do here is we're going to use this AL-10,000 item, and I'm going to go over and do a full Pio receiving process. Many of you folks are familiar with this process. So I'm pulling up the typical sightline Pio receiving process. Oops. And I have a Pio already set up. There it is, DP376. And it's for, notice it's for my AL-10,000. So I come over here, and this is the standard receiving screen. So I say, yeah, I'm going to receive against that. There's the Pio number, and I'll receive 20,000 pounds. I want to do a sample or a partial because I might want to do an extra receipt in case there's questions. But in this case, notice I'm indicating that I'm going to receive 20,000 pieces, okay? Because this is lot track, this is typical sightline behavior. It's suggesting a lot number. I could have manually assigned it, but in this case, I have the system providing a lot number. And then really all at this point I'm doing is hitting the receive button. And you guys know lots of times if you're doing lot tracking, the system wants to confirm that you're about to add a new lot number, so you hit OK there. But now, as we get a little pause here, what the system is doing is it's receiving that material, and that's that tried and true message that Sightline's always popped up that says one pending Pio receiving transfer. There's nothing pending about that. I never liked that. But that basically says the receiving process has taken place. So there's nothing different there. Now I'm going to hit the OK button. And now what you're seeing is the QC module kicking in. And what's going on here is the system is creating what the system calls as a receiver. The receiver number is 118. You can think of a receiver number as it's the control number. It's the unique identifier in the system that allows you to sort of track and collect inspection activities against a Pio receipt. So there it is, receiver number 118. The other thing that's happened in this case is because this material requires inspection, that's sort of what this message is saying, it's also taken the parts and instead of moving them into some typical inventory location, it's moved them into a QC inspection location. And one of the things you'll have to think about there is when you set up that QC inspection location, is it going to be nettable or non-nettable? For most companies, probably the overwhelming number of companies, that needs to be thought of as nettable because, as many of you know, nettable means that the material is considered usable, and it's very likely it's going to be usable. So you probably don't want to flag it as non-nettable because then that could, if you're using some of the material planning capabilities of Sightline, that could trigger replenishment if it's flagged as non-nettable. But that is something you need to think about. Okay. Notice there's that check for burrs comment. That's just a little alert you can set up that sort of plays out here during Pio receipt. So I'm hitting the OK button. And the other thing that's happening here is the system is launching, it's creating what you're seeing there is a receiving inspection tag. So you see the receiver number, there's my part number, there's some information, and the idea behind this, and this is a little output, a little report that's designed to sort of be printed on a small label, and you affix that to the box or the product. And then maybe you take this box and put it over in the receiving and inspection area. So it's an output or a label that you can put on the box. Okay, I'm going to close out of that. Now, what we just saw there is a receiving process that involved inspection. Now, I'm going to go back to my QC home page. I'll close out of the receiving screen. And if I come back here to the home page, all right, we have this idea of now there's, what we're going to do is we're going to inspect and disposition this receipt. So notice a long name for a form, QC Supplier Inspect Disposition. Again, this is one I already had loaded, so I'm just going to click on it instead of hitting the button, the hyperlink. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to filter for anything I created today. Okay, now that's the way I'm doing it, but keep in mind the idea here is if you're an inspector, okay, you might be picking up the box and seeing the receiver number and just typing in the receiver number because that's what you need to take action against. Now, that's what you're going to work with. Right? Notice there is some capabilities of doing things like this. If a receiver, once it's taken through its entire process, the system sort of automatically turns on this QC receiver complete. So while that's not on, you can use typical sightline filtering to do things like this. Say, show me receivers that are not complete. I've unchecked that checkbox, and then I should get a collection of everything that's not processed yet. But for many companies, the idea here is you're just coming in and saying, yep, I know there's my receiver number. And you guys see here on this screen that there's the item, there's the PO number, there's the amount of my receipt. And notice at this point, we haven't accepted, rejected, or put any on hold. So what we're going to do now is sort of move down to the bottom of this screen, okay? And there's sort of two things we're going to address here. Recording tests or inspections, and then eventually disposition the material. So we're still in Sightline proper here. Just a quick word on this. Some of you folks that have been with Sightline for a long time, maybe you are using the dock track or the labor track or shop track product. You know, that is somewhat being phased out, and now the Infor is offering the factory track product. The factory track product does include within its shop floor module the ability to do these next two steps by a person using the factory track application. But for right now, we're going to do this within Sightline. Okay, so I've pulled up this receiver, and I'm going to come down here and hit Record Tests and Inspections. And now I'm going to do things like say, yeah, there's my lot size of 20,000. Okay, I'm an inspector. I'm inspector number 1, and by the way, that's nothing more than a drop down of the Sightline employee table. All right, and I'm going to come over and say I'm recording inspection results against this lot, and there's the lot number, or this receipt and that lot number, and I'm hitting this Generate Test button. When I do that, the system lays down these requirements to capture a width and a height value. And at this point, I can do things like this. Say, yeah, I tested 20 sections of this steel. They all passed, and in this case, I have the ability to capture sort of quantitative results. I'm going to say my actual nominal value was 11.1, and that's a pass value. Okay, and my height, I tested those same 20 bars. They passed as well, and my value there was like 17.23. Now, one thing that I would like this to do that it doesn't do is when you record actual values, the system does not attempt to make a decision on whether that passed, whether that's compliant or not. It errs on the side, gives you an opportunity to capture data, you know, numerical or quantitative data, but it doesn't really do anything to automatically flag material as passed or failed. That's sort of up to the idea is it's up to the user because there could be some intangible. All right. Now, what I'm going to do here, and this scenario is this material is okay, so I'm flagging this as complete, and I'm hitting my Save button. And that's the idea of capturing test results. Now, by the way, this works with the doc track product as well. So if you had documents that indicated things like testing and inspection processes, those will show up in the dock track icon up there. The other thing before we leave this screen, if there was defective material and you wanted to capture defects at sort of the type of defect level, you could come over to the defects tab, and the idea is you can generate this list of defects. When you do that, the system serves up all the types of defects that might be relevant in your business. That's a table you set up. And then you can say on these units, 2 of them had defective because they were dirty. Now, I'm not going to do that in this case, but that's how you actually capture specific sort of defect code information. All right, so I'm not going to save that. So I'm coming back here, and look, so I've captured test results, all right, and I'm going to close out of this screen, and now because I have some parameters set a certain way, it required I did test results, but now that's done, I can now do what's called disposition of material. So when I do this, I click this button, and again I have things like that message shows up, and a different inspector, maybe a material handler now, comes in and says, yep, all 20,000 of this material is, I'm saying it's all good, and this is where you can do things like say, I'm going to disposition this as this is compliant material. Now there's a parameter setting in the system that says if the material is accepted, you don't necessarily have to put in a reason. It can default to just automatically just say the material is good. The reason why it is asking for a reason here is that in some situations companies will, like I said I think earlier, they'll receive material that was somewhat suspicious, but they're going to do sort of a use as is. So you could, on a reason code here, have a use as is. And the idea is you want to be able to capture those situations where maybe there were slight blemishes or something like that, but you still decided to use the material, but you wanted to capture the fact that that existed. So that's a sort of a reason code. Now you also have a disposition code. And as many of you probably know, these are all codes you have to set up in order to run the QCS system, which is good because you can set up the codes that meet your specific business needs. But in this case, with the disposition, I'm going to say move to stock. All right? So when I select move to stock, I can come over here and also say, do I want to print tags? These are tags that might indicate, hey, this material is past inspection, so I now want to flag it and label it that way. And I can say, really, I want, because when I did this and I inspected it, I ended up with three different boxes, so I can say, yeah, I want 3 different tags. So at this point, I hit the process button. It says disposition complete, and that's the idea right there, is it's printing that tag. Now here, make sure I don't confuse you on this. This next screen says, let me close out of that because the material has been flagged as compliant, okay, the system's going to launch another screen that says, okay, we'll now move the material out of an inspection location and we'll move it kind of to a typical, we're going to move this right to the shop floor. And now when I hit process, it's recording a move transaction. And that material has been moved out of the incoming inspection area of your warehouse, and it's been moved to the appropriate place, either in a regular inventory bin or maybe out on the shop floor. Now, if you look at that particular receiver, notice that it's now flagged as complete, and there you have a quantity received of 20,000, but you also have an accepted of 20,000. Now, did that kind of thoroughly, but that's a typical flow on the incoming side. Now, I want to switch over to the job side, the production side, and we're going to throw a couple wrinkles at this. All right. Now, as I set up a job order, and let's look at this other QC item screen here. In this case, notice I have an item set up where on the QC item screen I'm saying for this item, the ref type is J, and the operation now, or in this case, you need to indicate at what step in the manufacturing process are inspection results relevant. And in this case, I only have one operational step. I could have many. You know, if I have a long route, 15, 20 steps, I can have as many as I want. In this case, my part only has one, the manufacturing inspection step, operation 30. So in this case, notice I can come over and indicate on the test tab what kind of testing or data gathering I want. And this, I had some fun with this. I want to get a discharge rate, a flow rate, and kind of a pass-fail on the sort of cosmetic look and feel of the part. But that's set up right on the QC item screen. Now, the way that plays out is, and there's a parameter that allows for this sort of automatic creation of this. But watch, if I'm over here creating a job, all right, not when I create the job, when it's at a firm status, but when I change the job to a release status, that's when the system will go over and create the inspection requirements. Much like we saw on the PO side, it creates, again, what's called a receiver. But instead of using the QC supplier inspect disposition screen, we're going to use the QC in process inspect disposition screen. But again, it's a similar conceptual model. Okay. So again, in this case, to save time, I already took a job, created it, and released it. And when I did that, again, look, see job 35017. If I pull up this screen, again, this is where I'm going to record inspection results and ultimately disposition the material. I could have filtered for the receiver number, or what I could have done is said, just show me the job number. Okay? And there you can see that job is being processed against QCS receiver number 115. In this case, I've received 20 units, and I haven't accepted or rejected anything. Screen is very similar here. So notice, again, when I say the screen is very similar, I have this job inspection screen, and then I have a supplier inspection screen. But the sort of it's all in the same underlying table. Let's come back over to this screen, and in this case, to save time, I had already gone in the system, and I'd already recorded inspection or test results. So if I click that, you can kind of see that I've already gone in here and said, yeah, I captured data for the discharge rate, the flow rate, and the overall finish. And in this case, I said there was some failures on the flow rate. So back to what we talked about before, maybe in a situation like this, I might want to capture specific reasons for those defections or defective parts. That's where I could come over and hit the Generate Defects button and fill in the specific nature of what the defect was. But remember, at this point, is what you're really doing here is data capture. The system is not necessarily doing any kind of automatic determination of whether the material is compliant or not. It's just a nice tool to capture inspection data. And you can then use that inspection data to do various types of analysis, trend analysis, defect analysis. And it's good at that. But again, occasionally we'll hear some people say, well, why doesn't it automatically make a decision on whether the material is defect or is non-compliant? It just doesn't. When I say non-compliant, what I mean, it's not going to automatically flag the material as not accepted, or that you want to sort of scrap the material. It's not going to do that. But again, it allows you to capture the test results. So in this case, I'm going to close this. And because we know there was some sort of problem, when we go through the disposition process now, okay, an inspector is going to come up here and say, yeah, you know what? I spent an hour doing some inspection activities, and by the way, if you want to, that 1 hour can be moved in as a job transaction to capture the inspector's time to do the process. It actually inserts a record in the job transaction table. So it's like creates an unposted job transaction record. But in this case, what he's going to do is he's going to say, these 20 units were not accepted. All right? Now, this next thing's a little bit interesting. Watch what's going to happen here. I'm going to say that these are rejected. The 20 units are rejected. But based on a parameter setting in the system, the system is now saying, instead of just outright rejecting this, let's go ahead and, do you want to create an MRR? Do you want to, that's the system's way of saying, do you want to put this on MRB status? Okay, so do you want to put it in for MRB review, as opposed to outright rejecting it and sort of, and scrapping the material? So let's go ahead and say yes to this. And when you do that, it moves the parts down into this MRR hold area. All right, and now it's saying, what's the reason? And this is another table that you can use to capture diagnostics as to why a problem is occurring. We'll say this is some sort of dimensional problem. So in this case, again, we are specifically putting the material in MRB status. So when I hit the process button, sorry about that, notice the QCS module has a little built-in email generator, so you can indicate that, let's say you want to send this to the QC manager. So at this point, it can send an email to the QC manager or whoever you designate that to be. So I say yes or no there. But what's going on there is it just created what's called an MRR. All right, it's MRR number 16. Okay, and I'm going to hit the OK button. And now, again, it's now printing another tag, and the idea behind this is the material is now specifically being flagged as hold material. It's not flagged as good material. All right, so now where we stand on this particular flow is if we go back and look at the underlying receiver, remember this is sort of the master inspection record, we know that this material has been received and it's now flagged as on hold. Okay, and from here, if I wanted to, I could drill into the QC MRR screen. Okay, and there you can kind of see MRR 16 was created. It's related to a particular receiver. It's also, if we come down here, it's referenced to a particular a job order. That's what the reference there is. That's the operation number. Okay, there's the work center description. But it's at this point you can capture all sorts of information about MRB status. You know, what you did to sort of review, assess this material. So you can capture problem information, cause of defect. You can set up cause codes for the defects, and you can identify corrective or containment actions. You can also even capture the costs or the activities you went through on the MRB side. And so the idea there is you're saying, yeah, we had a quality engineer come in here and spend, he's an engineer, and he spent 2 hours looking at this, and that we're costing his time out at $40 an hour. Okay, now that's just raw data. That has no impact on the sightline accounting system. But these are the kinds of things you can do on an MRR. Okay, eventually you can decide to do what you're going to have to come in and say, this MRR has to be dispositioned. So if we click the disposition button, we can at this point still say, you know what, we found out this material upon second look is actually okay. So we're going to come over and say we're going to accept those 20 units. And maybe this is a time where you're going to do, somehow it's compliant, or maybe you set up a use as is here. And the disposition in this case is move to the next operation. So when I hit process here, the disposition is completed, and now it's printing another tag to say the material is good. I could have also, and maybe should have, done a process where I rejected the material, and that's going to take you down the process of maybe scrapping it or reworking it, things of that nature. Okay, so running short on time, but what we did there is we took a couple examples of a purchasing item and saw it sort of invoke inspection requirements. You walked that through, and you had sort of a successful or a receipt that had no problems. Then we did a situation where with a manufactured part, there was something suspicious about the part, so originally sort of dispositioned it to what the system calls MRR status. I think of that as MRB. And then we ended up basically saying, we thought there was something wrong, but it turned out to be okay material. Now, a couple other things about that. is notice on an MRR, and by the way, hopefully I won't lose you on this comment, an MRR is neutral to the, you can get an MRR created for something that was a PO or a purchased item, or in my case, an in-process, job order item. But the MRR screen works for both of those situations. So I have an MRR here, and it's just a number, and that's why when I look back here, I said this reference, that reference could either be a job order or a PO number. So it's agnostic here. It could be either a PO number or a job number. So the MRR table sort of works for both the purchasing side and the job side. The other thing to be aware of here is, again, if you have the idea of a problem that's sort of a bit habitually occurring, you could then take an MRR, and through this idea of hitting this button, you are creating a corrective action document for this MRR. Now, I probably wouldn't need to do this in this one because I said the material is okay, but it would still allow me to create a corrective action. And again, it's asked me if I want to do an email. But the bottom line there is I just created that corrective action. And a corrective action for either purchasing, that's either purchasing related that you're going to deal with a specific supplier, or an internally focused, it's a tool to drive the corrective action process. So if I click that button again, then I've actually launched the corrective action screen. And this is where you start indicating specific expectations of what a supplier or your internal quality people are going to do to sort of alleviate or remove this problem. Okay, that's good. Let's sort of move to completion here. If you remember, we started off here on the home forum in this overview. We went through kind of a quick process on both the PO and the job side. Just a quick word on the customer side. Again, the idea is that if there's some kind of special inspection requirement related to a particular customer, or for all customers, let's say you always want to invoke the requirement to print a CFC, that's what the customer module's for. One thing about that, the way that plays out is that if you turn on a QC item record, let's take a quick look at that. Watch, I'm going to filter this form, and I'm going to say, show me a QC item record that's customer related. And when I hit my filter button, I see I've got a few there. Let's look at this item. It's basically saying when I sell this item to this customer, I want to do a special discharge test. And I can look at see attached. I can reference an attachment to that. But that's an example of how the customer module might get used. Now, one thing about that, if you set something up like this, it will make sure you can't ship the material. Literally on the order shipping screen, you won't be able to process that until you go through the required customer inspection processes. Okay? Now, there's nothing that automatically triggers the creation of a disposition in that case. Here's what I mean by that. If I go back to the home page, all right, there's ways with the purchasing module and the job module that these inspection records get created sort of automatically, okay? But in the case of the customer order module, there's a utility, a process you have to run in order to create this disposition. Okay, so that's the quality module, or the customer module. I want to go back to the my overview, and let's just spend a second on this. We don't talk about the enterprise module as much, but if you come down to QC Enterprise, notice you have this things like ideas of topic management. If there's some kind of topic, maybe you're using this to capture accidents in your company, and you can set up topics for various types of accidents, and you can manage how often are specific types of accidents occurring. That's kind of a unique and clever deployment of it. change management's related to, let's say you have a business process in play and you're trying to sort of document the way you currently do things and then maybe manage a new and different way of managing that or having that business process flow through your company. Okay, same thing holds true in the process management. So it's kind of a clever little module. It doesn't get a whole lot of use, but maybe it could have a bigger use than many people are aware of. Okay, I want to make sure we left some time for questions. So that's the majority, or that's the entirety of what I was planning on presenting. So let's go ahead and pause here and see if there are any questions.